Ishmael, a name that carries a powerful meaning, God heard. But what exactly did God hear? To understand that, we need to go back in time to a story filled with challenges, doubts, and, of course, faith. Ishmael was the first son of Abraham, the patriarch widely recognized as a central figure in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. He was born when Abraham was 86 years old. Just think about that for a second. A man already advanced in age, waiting for decades for God's promise. And then, finally, a son is born, though not exactly the way Abraham had imagined. The choice of the name Ishmael wasn't random. It's a testament to a moment when God stepped into Hagar's life, Ishmael's mother. Hagar, an Egyptian servant of Sarah, Abraham's wife, found herself alone, distressed, and fleeing from a hostile environment. It was in this moment of despair that an angel appeared to her with a divine message. She would have a son, and his name would be Ishmael, because God had heard the cry of her heart. And here's the beauty of it. Ishmael's story starts with a reminder that God is attentive to the details, even the ones most people overlook. Isn't that a powerful lesson? Even in the loneliest moments, God sees us and hears us. If you've ever felt like Hagar, isolated, hopeless, think about how this story might resonate in your own life. There are times when everything seems to be falling apart, but Ishmael's story teaches us that there's a God who listens, who pays attention to our tears. Maybe in the middle of your struggles, you're waiting for a sign. Could this be it? Take a moment to reflect. How can you apply this truth to your daily life? Maybe it's time to open your heart in prayer, to seek that connection with God, because just like Hagar experienced, He's listening. Another fascinating detail about Ishmael is how his name reflects not just one isolated episode, but a universal message. He represents the voice of those who are often forgotten or marginalized. And that makes us stop and think, how are we as humans listening to the cries around us? Are we paying attention to others' needs, just like God did with Hagar? Small actions, like lending an ear to someone struggling or offering help to someone in need, can make an enormous difference. And speaking of listening, the Bible often calls us to hear, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. So many times, we get caught up in the hustle of life, missing the signs around us. What if you took a moment of silence today just to listen? Who knows? You might hear something that could completely change your perspective. Ishmael's arrival in Abraham and Hagar's lives brought both blessings and challenges. How do you think that shaped family dynamics and Abraham's own journey? It's intriguing to consider how, even in plans that seem unconventional, God finds ways to reveal His purpose. But here's where we touch on another interesting question. How exactly did Hagar and Abraham come together for Ishmael to be born? This story has so many layers that help us understand the cultural and spiritual context of that time. Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant, plays a crucial role in the story that brought Ishmael into the world. But before we dive into her story, let's set the scene. Back then, a woman's inability to have children was seen as a curse, something that could completely undermine her value in society. Sarah, Abraham's wife, lived through this personal torment. For years, she carried the frustration of not being able to have children, even with God's promise that Abraham would be the father of a great nation. And here's where the story takes a bold turn. Sarah suggests that Abraham have a child with Hagar. Sounds like a simple solution, right? But as with so many human decisions, this choice would lead to unexpected consequences. This practice, known as surrogacy, was pretty common in ancient cultures. Hagar, being a servant, didn't really have much of a say in the matter. She was given to Abraham to fulfill a purpose that wasn't hers, it was Sarah's. What's interesting, though, is that the Bible doesn't directly condemn this practice, but instead shows us how human decisions can lead to conflict, especially when they're not fully aligned with God's will. And here's something worth reflecting on. How often do we make snap decisions, thinking we're helping God fulfill His promises in our lives, only to end up creating more problems? The union between Abraham and Hagar resulted in the conception of Ishmael. Now imagine the complexity of this situation. Sarah, who had come up with the plan, starts to see Hagar pregnant with the man she loves. The text tells us that Hagar, after getting pregnant, began to look down on Sarah. This dynamic created a tension that only grew worse over time. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. When we try to solve our problems on our own, we often end up creating new wounds, both in ourselves and in others. But here's a detail worth paying attention to. God didn't abandon anyone in this story. Even in the middle of conflict and human missteps, He had a plan. This reminds us that even when we mess up, God is still at work, turning our mistakes into opportunities for growth and learning. Maybe you've made decisions that seemed right at the time, but led to complications. The story of Hagar and Abraham shows us that reconciliation is possible and that challenges can teach us valuable lessons. Hagar's role also pushes us to think about her as more than just the servant who gave birth to Abraham's first son. She was so much more than that. Hagar was a woman who faced tough circumstances with courage. Her story is a powerful reminder that God values every person, no matter their social status or background. Have you ever stopped to think about how God might be using you, even in situations that feel completely out of your control? Hagar's journey shows us that even when life puts us in situations we didn't choose, we can still find meaning. Her obedience to Sarah's plan, even when it caused her pain, demonstrates resilience. At the same time, we see that God didn't ignore her suffering. He met her in the wilderness, at her most vulnerable moment, and gave her a promise. That's a reminder that God doesn't just see us. He values us, even when we feel invisible. And then there's Abraham's faith in all of this. He had received God's promise that he would be the father of a great nation, yet he went along with Sarah's suggestion without question. Was he also feeling impatient about God's timing? Let's face it, when the wait feels too long, we're often tempted to take matters into our own hands. But this story reminds us that patience is a virtue worth cultivating. Maybe it's time to ask yourself, where in your life do you need to trust God's timing more? Another fascinating thing about this story is how it connects with modern struggles. How many families today face conflict because of poorly thought-out decisions? How often, in our attempts to help God, do we create more problems than solutions? Abraham and Hagar's union offers us a chance to reflect on our own choices and how they impact not just us, but the people around us. And finally, we have the relationship between Hagar and Sarah, which highlights the fragility of human connections. The resentment, jealousy, and competition that arose between them aren't so different from the feelings we experience in our daily interactions. But what's incredible is how God worked in both of their lives, showing that He's able to bring healing and redemption, even in the most complicated relationships. This union brought tensions to the surface that would shape the future of the entire family. But the consequences of this relationship didn't stop with Hagar, Sarah, and Abraham. They lead us to a central point: the covenant God made with Abraham, and how Ishmael, even though he wasn't the son of the promise, was still included in that plan. The divine covenant is a central milestone in Abraham's story, and it's impossible to talk about it without mentioning Ishmael. Even though Ishmael wasn't the child of the promise, that honor was reserved for Isaac, he was still included. In the sign of the covenant between God and Abraham, circumcision, and here's something deeply meaningful. In His infinite grace, God didn't exclude Ishmael from this symbol of the covenant, showing that He's a God who operates beyond human expectations. This teaches us something fundamental. Even if you don't see yourself as the first choice in some area of your life, God still has a plan for you. In the Bible, circumcision wasn't just a physical ritual. It carried profound spiritual meaning. It was a constant reminder of the covenant between God and his people. At 99 years old, Abraham was commanded to circumcise not only himself, but also every male in his household, including Ishmael, who was 13 at the time. Stop and imagine that for a moment. It wasn't an easy or comfortable task, but it was an act of obedience. This makes us think about the times we're called to take hard steps in our faith. How far are we willing to go to obey? Ishmael, despite being young, was included in this act of consecration. It's amazing how God saw him as part of the plan, even when many might have considered him secondary to Isaac. This reminds us that, in God's kingdom, no one is insignificant. Have you ever stopped to think about how God might be calling you to something greater, even when circumstances suggest otherwise? Maybe like Ishmael you feel sidelined, but God is saying, I see you and you're part of my purpose. What makes this moment even more remarkable is how it symbolizes the inclusion of everyone in something greater. Circumcision wasn't just an individual act. It united the community in a shared purpose. Think about how this applies today. So often, our acts of faith aren't just about ourselves, but about how we can impact those around us. Maybe it's time to ask yourself, what step of faith can you take today to strengthen your connection with God and others? Ishmael's inclusion in the covenant also highlights God's justice and mercy. Even knowing that Isaac would be the child of the promise, God didn't overlook Ishmael. He had a plan for him, a promise that he would become the father of a great nation. This shows us that God's plan is expansive, and that even when we feel out of the spotlight, he's still at work in our story. Have you ever wondered how God's plans are unfolding in your life, even in the moments when you don't notice? Another fascinating aspect is how this event underscores the importance of collective obedience. Abraham, as the leader, had to take the initiative, but every male in his household participated. This shows us that our faith decisions often directly impact those around us. So, take a moment to reflect. How are your choices influencing your family, friends, and community? Maybe it's time to finally make that decision you've been putting off, knowing it could inspire others. It's also worth noting the significance of Ishmael's age, 13 years old, at the time. That's an age when decisions begin to shape a person's character and future. By being circumcised, Ishmael not only became part of the covenant, but also began his journey as someone who would carry a legacy. This reminds us that it's never too early or too late to step into God's purpose. Whatever your age, you can start today. Ishmael's inclusion in the covenant challenges us to rethink how we view God's plans. So often, we want things to happen our way, but God has a much bigger vision. He includes those society might overlook or dismiss. What a powerful lesson. How can you apply this to your life? Maybe it's time to look around and include someone who needs support, just as God included Ishmael. The covenant and Ishmael's circumcision also set the stage for the next chapter of his life. Even though he was included in the covenant, Ishmael would face challenges and family tensions that would shape his future. And this shows us something profound. Being part of God's plan doesn't mean a life free of difficulties. It means a life full of purpose. Are you ready to face your own challenges, knowing God is by your side? Finally, Ishmael's story and the covenant leave us with one question. How can we embrace God's call in our lives, even when it doesn't match our expectations? This is where Ishmael's journey intersects with ours, leading us to explore the next events that would shape his life and legacy. The birth of Isaac, the son God promised to Abraham and Sarah, marked a major turning point, not just in the story of the divine promise, but also in the family dynamics. Up until that moment, Ishmael had been Abraham's only son, holding a unique position in the family. But Isaac's arrival brought inevitable tension, especially between Sarah and Hagar. Their relationship was already fragile, and the birth of the promised heir only amplified the underlying conflicts that had been brewing all along. Sarah, who had initially suggested that Hagar bear a child for Abraham, began to see Ishmael as a threat to Isaac's future. During a celebration when Isaac was being weaned, Sarah noticed Ishmael, now a teenager, mocking or playing in a way she found inappropriate. That incident, recorded in the Bible, became the tipping point for Sarah to demand that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away from Abraham's household. Imagine the weight of that decision. It wasn't just about living arrangements, it was about securing the future of God's promise. This conflict reminds us of how human emotions can complicate already difficult situations. Sarah, as a mother, was concerned about Isaac's well-being, but her actions also reveal how jealousy and insecurity can cloud our judgment. Hagar, on the other hand, was once again placed in a vulnerable position, forced to leave the safety of her home with her son. It's hard not to feel compassion for Hagar and Ishmael as they faced rejection and abandonment at such a critical moment in their lives. But God, in His faithfulness, didn't abandon them. When Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the desert, lost and out of resources, God stepped in once more. He heard Ishmael's cries and sent an angel to comfort Hagar, assuring her that her son would become the father of a great nation. This moment is so powerful because it reminds us that even when people reject us, God never does. Maybe you've experienced moments where you felt left out or forgotten. Remember, God sees, hears, and cares for you. The tension between Sarah and Hagar also symbolizes a deeper struggle between God's plan and human solutions. When Sarah suggested that Hagar have a child with Abraham, she was trying to help God fulfill His promise. But that decision created consequences she hadn't foreseen. How often do we, in our impatience, make decisions that end up complicating things even more? This story challenges us to trust God's timing, even when it feels like nothing is happening. Another key lesson is how fragile human relationships can be, especially when they're marked by jealousy, comparisons, and unresolved pain. Sarah and Hagar represent two sides of the same coin, a struggle for space, recognition, and security. It makes us think about how we handle our own relationships. Are we feeding unnecessary conflicts, or are we seeking ways to reconcile and heal old wounds? Abraham's role in this story is also fascinating. As the patriarch, he found himself caught between two women and two sons, trying to navigate his responsibilities to everyone involved. When Sarah demanded that he send Hagar and Ishmael away, Abraham was deeply distressed, but God instructed him to listen to Sarah, assuring him that he would take care of Ishmael. This teaches us that even in tough decisions, we can trust that God has a bigger plan, even if we can't see how it'll all work out just yet. Hagar and Ishmael's exile wasn't just a moment of suffering, it was also the start of a new journey. God turned the wilderness into a place of provision and renewal for them. That's such a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, God can lead us to restoration. What feels like the end might actually be the beginning of something new. Are you walking through a wilderness right now? What might God be trying to teach you in this season? Beyond that, the conflict between Sarah and Hagar can also be seen as a metaphor for the internal struggle we all face. On one side, there's trust in God's promises, represented by Sarah and Isaac, and on the other, there's our tendency to rely on our own efforts, symbolized by Hagar and Ishmael. This tension challenges us to choose faith over fear, to lean on God rather than trying to solve everything on our own. This conflict set the stage for the future generations of Ishmael and Isaac, two powerful lineages that would carry both tension and the potential for reconciliation. It's a reminder that even in the midst of conflict, God is weaving a story far greater than we can imagine. But what about Ishmael's legacy? How did he fulfill God's promise to become the father of a great nation? That's a story worth exploring. When God promised Hagar that her son Ishmael would be the father of a great nation, he wasn't speaking figuratively. That promise was literally fulfilled. After being sent into the wilderness, Hagar and Ishmael didn't just survive, they thrived. Ishmael became the patriarch of 12 tribes, known as the 12 princes, who laid the foundation for a powerful lineage. This story shows us how, even in tough situations, God can turn hardships into platforms for greatness. Have you ever stopped to think about how the challenges you're facing today might be shaping your future legacy? Ishmael's legacy is deeply tied to the idea of resilience. He grew up in the wilderness, an unforgiving environment where survival was a daily battle. But it was in that same wilderness that he learned the lessons that built his strength and character. This is a practical lesson for all of us. How often do we try to avoid life's deserts? What if, instead of running from them, we embrace those moments as opportunities for growth and learning? After all, it was in the wilderness that Ishmael became a leader. The 12 tribes that descended from Ishmael, mentioned in the Bible, are often associated with Arab peoples. These groups spread across vast regions from Arabia to parts of the Middle East, living nomadic and trade-focused lifestyles. Their way of life was described as being in conflict with others. Indeed, at first glance that might sound negative, but it also reflects the independence and fighting spirit that defined these tribes. In a world where alliances and battles were the norm, they survived because they learned to adapt and fight for their existence. That sense of independence makes us think about how we handle challenges in our own lives. Do we have that same capacity for resilience and adaptability? Many times we face situations that feel impossible to overcome, but Ishmael's story reminds us that God equips us with the tools we need to face our deserts. Maybe all we're missing is a little more courage and determination to tackle those challenges head-on. Another fascinating aspect of Ishmael's legacy is his connection to the 3 major monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In Islam, he is considered a direct ancestor of Muhammad, the prophet who founded the religion. This not only highlights Ishmael's historical significance, but also shows how his influence transcends cultures, languages, and centuries. It's incredible to think about how a promise made by God in the wilderness still echoes today. Imagine how your life might impact future generations, even if you can't see it right now. The nomadic lifestyle of Ishmael's descendants also carries important spiritual lessons. They lived on the move, relying on God's provision for their survival. That teaches us about detachment and trust. So often we cling to material things or ideas of stability that, in reality, are fleeting. Are we willing to trust God to guide us, even when we don't know what's ahead? Ishmael's legacy also challenges us to think more broadly about the idea of purpose. He wasn't the child of the promise, but God still had a plan for him. That shows us we don't need to be in the spotlight to have value. God uses each of us in ways we might not understand at the moment. Maybe you're in a position today that feels small or insignificant, but Ishmael's story reminds us that God is writing a much bigger story. The promise that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation also reflects God's faithfulness to his word. Even in unfavorable circumstances, God fulfilled his promise. This encourages us to trust him, even when things seem tough or uncertain. He doesn't forget the promises he makes, and he is faithful to keep them. Is today the day to remind yourself of the promises God has made for your life and renew your faith in him? Another interesting point is that Ishmael's legacy carries a message of reconciliation. Despite the conflicts between the lineages of Isaac and Ishmael, we see in the Bible that when Abraham passed away, both sons came together to bury him. This shows that, despite differences and tensions, reconciliation is possible. It challenges us to seek peace in our own relationships, especially those that feel broken. Finally, Ishmael's story and legacy leave us with one final lesson. It's not about how you start, it's about how you respond to God's call. Ishmael began his life under complicated circumstances, but became the father of a powerful nation, fulfilling God's promise. His story sets the stage to explore the deeper contrast between him and his half-brother Isaac, a contrast that highlights the different ways God works in each of our lives. The contrast between Ishmael and Isaac isn't just a matter of family or cultural history. It carries a deep symbolic meaning that echoes throughout Scripture and even into our own lives. While Ishmael represents human effort to attain God's promises, Isaac stands for the fulfillment of those promises through divine grace. This duality challenges us to reflect on how much we trust God versus how often we rely on our own strength to achieve what He has promised. Ishmael's story begins with an attempt to help God. Sarah, frustrated by her infertility, suggests that Abraham have a child with Hagar, the Egyptian servant. Ishmael was born out of a human solution to a divine problem. This decision reminds us of how often we try to force things when we feel like God is taking too long. But the consequences of that human effort created conflicts that reverberated for generations. How many times have you tried to fix something your way, only to realize you should have waited for God's timing? Isaac, on the other hand, was the direct fulfillment of God's promise. He was born when Abraham and Sarah were well past childbearing age, when it was biologically impossible for them to have children. This shows that God isn't limited by human circumstances. Isaac represents grace, the divine intervention that surpasses all expectations. This story challenges us to trust God, even when everything seems impossible. What are you facing today that feels like there's no solution? Could it be time to surrender it to God and let Him take over? The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, draws a parallel between Ishmael and Isaac to illustrate the difference between living by the flesh and living by the Spirit. He describes Ishmael as the son of the slave woman, representing those who rely on their own works to achieve righteousness, and Isaac as the son of the free woman, representing those who trust in God's grace. This comparison is powerful because it forces us to examine our own lives. Are we living in the freedom of grace, or are we trapped in the limitations of our own efforts? This contrast also makes us think about the outcomes of our choices. When we follow our own will, like Sarah and Abraham did in conceiving Ishmael, we often create unnecessary complications. But when we trust God, as shown in Isaac's birth, we experience the fulfillment of His promises. That doesn't mean everything will be easy, but it does mean we're aligned with His plan. Maybe it's time for you to reflect. Which areas of your life need more trust in God and less human control? Another interesting point is how Ishmael and Isaac coexisted for a time. They grew up together, shared family moments, but their destinies were different. This reflects how we often live with the consequences of our human decisions while waiting for the fulfillment of God's promises. What we do during that waiting period is crucial. Are we trying to fix our mistakes on our own, or are we trusting God to redeem even our failures? The symbolism of Ishmael and Isaac also points to a universal spiritual truth. God's plan doesn't exclude anyone, but He works uniquely in each person's life. Ishmael wasn't the child of the promise, but God still had a purpose for him. Isaac was the heir of the covenant, but that didn't diminish Ishmael's importance. This teaches us that just because God works differently in someone else's life doesn't mean we're being overlooked. Each of us has a unique role in His plan. Additionally, the contrast between Ishmael and Isaac reminds us that God's promises don't depend on our abilities or merits. Abraham and Sarah were completely incapable of having a child in their old age, but God acted. This shows us that our strength and effort aren't what determine the fulfillment of God's promises. What truly matters is our faith and willingness to wait for His timing. Think about something you've been trying to fix on your own and ask yourself, is it time to let God take control? The relationship between Ishmael and Isaac also serves as an example of how differences can coexist within the same story. Though their paths were distinct, both played significant roles in the fulfillment of God's plan. This challenges us to see the value in others, even when their stories seem different from ours. Are we appreciating the people around us, even those whose journeys diverge from our own? Finally, the contrast between Ishmael and Isaac prepares us for a deeper reflection on the impact of their lineages and the spiritual legacy they represent. While Ishmael became the father of independent nations, Isaac became the direct channel of the divine promise that would culminate in Christ. This leads us to consider how might our own choices and faith impact not only our lives, but also the generations to come. That's a question that unfolds as we explore the next chapters of the story. Ishmael is a central figure who transcends the biblical narrative and connects directly to modern history, especially through Islamic tradition. Many Muslims believe Ishmael is the direct ancestor of Muhammad, the prophet and founder of Islam. This connection not only solidifies Ishmael's importance for millions around the world, but also reinforces the idea that God's promises, made thousands of years ago, still carry significance today. It makes us pause and think, how do faith and history intertwine to shape the world we know now? Ishmael's connection to Islam is particularly emphasized in Muslim tradition, which regards him as both a prophet and a spiritual leader. According to this tradition, it was Ishmael, not Isaac, who stood beside Abraham during the building of the Kaaba, the most sacred site in Islam, located in Mecca. This detail underscores Ishmael's pivotal role in the foundation of Islamic faith, highlighting him as a crucial link between Abraham and the Arab nations. This perspective reminds us that, while religious traditions may differ, they often share points of convergence that reveal a shared spiritual heritage. Ishmael's link to the Arab world is also evident through his descendants. The 12 sons of Ishmael, mentioned in the Bible, are often associated with the Arab tribes that spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. These tribes, known for their resilience and commercial expertise, played a vital role in both ancient and modern history. They established trade routes, influenced cultures, and created connections between civilizations. In this sense, Ishmael's legacy extends beyond the spiritual realm and touches on economic and cultural contributions. This heritage invites us to consider Ishmael's influence in a world that often focuses on divisions. His lineage, while distinct from Isaac's, demonstrates that both sons of Abraham uniquely contributed to the development of civilizations. How often do we overlook the richness that diversity can bring? Ishmael's story encourages us to value differences and recognize that God works in unique ways through different peoples and cultures. One fascinating aspect of Ishmael's story is how he also symbolizes reconciliation. Despite the historical tensions between the lineages of Isaac and Ishmael, moments of unity and understanding appear. For instance, when Abraham passed away, both sons came together to honor their father. This act reminds us that even in the midst of conflicts and differences, it's possible to find common ground and work towards something greater. Perhaps this is an essential lesson for today's world, where divisions seem so widespread. Ishmael's influence can also be seen in how he is remembered in religious and historical texts. In the Quran, Ishmael is praised for his patience and obedience, traits that make him a model of faith for Muslims. This recognition challenges us to think about the legacy we're building. What values and actions do we want future generations to remember about us? Maybe it's time to reflect on how we're impacting the world around us. Additionally, Ishmael's story reminds us of the importance of honoring our roots. He grew up in the wilderness, an environment that shaped his strength and determination. His life lessons continue to resonate, especially in cultures that celebrate resilience and perseverance. What can we learn from this? Perhaps it's time to look at our own origins and recognize how they've shaped us and prepared us for the challenges we face today. Ishmael's impact on the modern world is also a powerful reminder that God's promises are not bound by time or space. What began as a word spoken to Hagar in the wilderness became a reality that spanned centuries and continents. This encourages us to trust in God's promises, even when they feel distant or impossible to fulfill. After all, who would have imagined that a young boy cast into the desert would become the father of so many nations? Finally, Ishmael's relevance in modern history is an invitation to explore our own connections to the past. The Bible and other sacred texts aren't just records of ancient events. They're bridges that help us understand our present and shape our future. Ishmael's story challenges us to find our place in this larger narrative and reflect on how our actions today can impact future generations. This connection to modern history isn't the end of Ishmael's journey. It's a gateway to understanding his spiritual and cultural impact more deeply. And it leads us to a bigger question. How can we use these lessons to reconnect with God's promises and apply them to our daily lives? Now that you know Ishmael's story, do you see how his journey is packed with profound lessons about faith, purpose, and God's sovereignty? His life shows us that, even in the hardest situations, God sees, hears, and has a bigger plan for each of us. Maybe like Ishmael, you've faced moments of rejection, loneliness, or felt out of place. But remember this, God can turn even the driest deserts into places of promise and provision. So let me ask you, how can you apply these lessons to your own life? Is it time to stop trying to handle everything on your own and start trusting God more? Do you need to rethink how you see challenges, realizing that even those tough moments can shape your character and prepare you for something greater? Take some time to reflect. Ishmael's legacy challenges us to look to the future with hope, knowing that our impact can go far beyond what we imagine. If this story inspired you, why not share these insights with others? Don't keep this to yourself. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like on the video. That way, you'll keep receiving content like this and help spread these life-changing truths. Also, be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. They're popping up on the screen right now and are full of reflections to deepen your understanding of the Bible and its stories. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the end. May God bless your life and inspire you to fully embrace the promises He has for you. See you in the next video.